morning. I'd like to thank everybody for coming to our Weissberg event this morning on criminal justice reform in the state of Wisconsin. I'd like to introduce our three, actually I'm not going to say panelists because we're envisioning this as more of a conversation. At first we have Professor Michael O'Hear, Professor of Law at Marquette University, who is a nationally recognized authority on criminal punishment. He teaches criminal law and related courses. He's the editor of the Federal Sentencing Reporter and the author of more than 60 scholarly books, articles, and book chapters on sentencing, criminal reform, and other legal topics. He is a graduate of Yale College and of the Yale Law School. He joined the Marquette Law faculty in 2000 and served as the law school's first associate dean for research from 2008 to 2015. He was also a member of the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission from 2010 to 2016, and from 2015 to 2016 he directed the Marquette Clemency Workshop, which provided legal assistance to federal prisoners who were seeking clemency from President Obama. Next, we have this year's Weissberg Chair, Stephen Hawkins. He is a social justice litigator and leader whose career has been devoted to finding ways to improve a criminal justice system that disproportionately targets minorities and other economically disadvantaged populations. He recently served as the president of the Coalition for Public Safety and has also served as the executive director of Amnesty International and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and the executive director of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. He has worked to abolish the death penalty and represented African American men across the Deep South and successfully led a campaign to abolish the death penalty for juvenile crimes. He studied economics at Harvard University and completed a law degree at New York University. And lastly, we have State Representative Evan Goyke, who grew up in Madison. He earned his bachelor's in political science at St. John's University in Minnesota in 2005 and a JD in law from Marquette Law School. Prior to his election in 2012, he was an attorney in the Office of the Wisconsin State Public Defender, and he has also served as an adjunct professor of law at Marquette. In the current legislative session of the Wisconsin State Assembly, he's serving on a number of committees that are relevant to today's discussion, including the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee, where he is the ranking member, Family Law, where he is also the ranking member, Corrections, Veterans and Military Affairs, and Housing. And he has introduced a number of criminal reform bills into the Wisconsin State Legislature. So I've asked each of our speakers to give a brief overview. Stephen Hawkins is going to talk about justice reform at the national level. Professor O'Hear is then going to talk about it at Wisconsin level, and Representative Goyke is going to talk about it in terms of some of the legislative efforts that are going on in Wisconsin. Each of them is going to go ahead and make their opening remarks, and then the rest of it we're hoping will be a conversation amongst the three of them and all of you as well. So if you are interested in asking a question after we get through this initial round, please feel free to raise your hands. Right? And with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear this? Great. So I wanted to give a bit of a sense of what's happening nationally, and at least at the state level, with respect to criminal justice reform. I'm going to start and say a few words about what have been some of the efforts at the beginning stage before people are going to trial and are getting a conviction. And at that point, there are two ways one could go. You could cycle people into prison and continue prison growth, or you could think about alternatives to correction. So key state efforts that are happening around the country are certainly how to create pretrial diversion programs that, such as drug courts, that can keep people out of prison, obtain treatment, and hopefully at that point of intervention, be more effective in their particular needs. There are problems with drug courts. One is that you need them at every county level, and they are costly to set up. And so what I have seen around the challenge around the country with the drug courts is that you will find that it's just not possible to have them in every county. So then what happens, of course, is that if you're lucky enough to be in a county that has a drug court established by the state, you get one treatment. And if you're not so lucky, you will still end up in prison. So challenges with at least that aspect of pretrial diversion. Bail reform is exciting and happening at different jurisdictions around the country now. So we've had a money bail system in place forever, and the whole notion in our Constitution is that bail should not be excessive. But money bail has worked such that there's a certain level of bail, of a bond, depending upon what the offense has been. Very little individual determination as to whether you can afford to pay that amount. That has started to be challenged by advocates, by people bringing some successful litigation in the country. So down near where I live, I live in Maryland, but Washington D.C. as a city, as the seat of our government, did away with a money bail system several years ago now and replaced it with an assessment system where the court will use a program, it's almost like an algorithm, to determine whether someone poses a risk of either flight or danger to the community. People have questions about these assessment tools that are used. Can racial bias creep in depending upon what factors are looked at with assessment? But I can say that it is working effectively in DC. I mean, people, when you think about it, somebody who has the means to potentially flee, but who may have the resources can make bail in this country, and people who stand the least chance of really going anywhere end up getting stuck in jail because they cannot make bail. So that is changing. New Jersey just went through a process where one of the good things that Governor Christie accomplished was to push for the end of a cash bail system in the state of New Jersey. Needless to say, the bail bond industry has fought this tooth, nail, and claw because we're talking about, millions, probably billions of dollars that actually flow through to the bail industry. It gets looked at in sort of these localized bail bondsmen, but it all ties back to Wall Street and large fiduciary bonds. And so it is a challenge around the country. But moving on from that point of entry to say a few things about when people are actually in the system and sentencing. So we have in the country, and what has ballooned the criminal justice system has been mandatory minimums and sentencing enhancements like truth in sentencing, which requires you to serve 85% of your sentence. We've decimated parole discretion, and now there are efforts, of course, to try to turn this back. Efforts to reduce mandatory minimums have been difficult. What we've seen in states like California recently is that certain drug offenses that used to carry mandatory minimums were reduced, and so those laws were prospective, and then and so first you get it passed saying, going forward, this is the new law, and then you come back later on and address everybody who has a sentence, and there's some retroactive application. So here's the thing: you end up with people who technically now are parole eligible, the law's been changed, thousands of people potentially could leave prison because they no longer technically have to serve the this lengthy sentence? Well, we've developed a mass incarceration system in the country which was designed to put people into prison. It was designed to suck them in. It was never designed to let them out. So how you move thousands of people out of prison becomes one of our essential challenges. Some of you who may have heard me talk last night, I was struck by the fact that President Obama, as people became eligible within the federal system in a similar way to be released, and the president set up a clemency system. Even with the vast resources of the President of the United States, he needed to be able to go outside to get the job done. Michael was telling me that he and some of his students took about 10 cases at Marquette. So the President of the United States had to get the help of the outside bar and good law professors like Michael to get the job done. And that's a couple of thousand people. So how in the world do we begin to change a system that has 2 million people within it and get them home? And we're going to have to make, I think, a larger investment in supervisory release, getting an active parole measures again. Or we're going to have to think of things like what's been floated in Michigan, where we could create something called presumptive parole, so the way presumptive parole works is that you've reached a point when you should be paroled, and the system, the presumption is you're going to go home. And there would be a trigger that would start a set of actions to get you out of the door. As opposed to now where it's a discretionary process, you have to get on the parole board's calendar, and it's just a very slow bureaucratic process. Imagine a system where it's presumed that you're going unless there's some reason to stop that process. So maybe that's part of our future. Tragically, the whole prison population is going to start to get older. We created these sentencing enhancements that mean now that we will have, by the year 2030, 1/3 of all people in prison in the country are going to be over the age of 55. So we're seeing people with dementia in prison, all of the needs that are now arising around hospice care, and it is a huge problem that corrections is going to be facing. So, how do we create really effective geriatric release programs that get older folks out of prison? No state has really even begun to grapple effectively with that problem. So let me turn now to the last part, which is when someone is leaving prison, how do we work to ensure that they're able to actually stay out of prison, not have to return? We have had for years a punitive system of parole and probation where if you made one mistake and had what was called a technical violation of your parole, you would end up back in prison, So one dirty urine, right, where you made a mistake would bring you right back to prison. Well, luckily states have been rethinking that. North Carolina, for example, has a pretty good effective program where, Commissioner Grice, who actually used to be in the legislature, left the legislature, is now the head of corrections there, but he's created what he calls the DIP program. He says, well, if you make a dip where so something goes wrong, we will work with you intensively for 30 days and try to correct try to get you back on the right path, as opposed to the old system where that one mistake would have meant going back to finish your sentence. So we also have to think about then what is called reentry. How do we set up somebody for success when they leave prison? How do we treat somebody leaving prison as a returning citizen, which is a very different terminology than an ex-felon? And what barriers are there to success? We live in a country now in most states where if you want to get a certain license to start a business, there are barriers for people with felony convictions. And all of that can and should be changed. And there are significant barriers at the federal level. And as I close, I had worked some years ago with Walmart when I was at the NAACP. They asked what they could do as a company, and we said, look, you're the country's largest employer. Create an effective reentry program. And to their credit, they did. But the challenge has been to get other companies to be willing to do the same. There are companies that have informal policies that are actually very good, but they're not willing to go on record that they hire people with felony convictions. And their quietness, and the reason they don't want to go on record is they fear that their customers will stop going to their stores. So that's part of the challenge. And I will close by saying this, that we have to think more about individuals coming out of prison, people in prison, in ways that value them as human beings, that we do not see them as throwaway people, that they are part of our community, and treat them with dignity and respect. That's a fundamental challenge that we face, because the reality is that we think that, yes, there are lots of people in prison with non-violent drug offenses, but the reality is that's only about 10% of the population. There are lots of people in prison who have a crime that falls in what has been classified more as a violent crime. Now, I challenge some of the size of everybody who's now considered a violent criminal. Somebody who's the difference between the person who's standing there and when something bad happens and the person actually pulls a trigger, everyone sort of gets sucked in to the same category. But with that said, we have to be willing to think about people beyond just this binary of whether you're a violent criminal or a non-violent criminal. We have to treat everyone with dignity and the thinking that they can be redeemed. And if we do not, we are going to continue to just see our prison system grow and grow and grow. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, and good morning, all of you. It's a real pleasure and a treat for me to be with you this morning. I had a book come out about a year ago about the coming of mass incarceration to Wisconsin, and I have a few slides, a few PowerPoint slides that distill some of the information from that, because, of course, it's a program. There has to be some PowerPoint involved somewhere. The first slide here depicts the size of the Wisconsin prison population going back to the early 1970s. That's the blue line on the top. And if you were to rewind this back even a little further, going back all the way to the 1950s, you'd see that the prison population for a long period of time was very stable at about 2,500 inmates. In 1974, there was a little bit of an uptick in that population size. Nobody thought about it at the time, but in retrospect, we now know that was the first in 30 consecutive years, unbroken 3 decades, of annual increases in the size of the state prison population. By the time that reaches its peak, a little over a dozen years ago, the population is up to 23,000, and it's basically been moving within that band ever since. So if you think about that, historically we had an equilibrium of about 2,500. Now our new equilibrium is 22 to 23,000. So we've got a prison population which is about 9 times higher than it was at its earlier equilibrium point. The other line on the graph is the red line. That's the number of arrests for major violent crimes in the state. And I always think it's helpful to look at the number of prisoners in relation to the number of arrests for major crime. Because you can think about the arrests as the inputs into the criminal justice system and prisoners as the outputs. And if you compare those lines, you see that they actually rose in tandem roughly for the first half of the imprisonment boom, right up to about 1990. And then beginning in 1990, the arrest rate stabilizes. I mean, there are some peaks and valleys in there. There's some ups and downs, but basically the story is one of stability since 1990 with the arrest rates. And yet the prison population continued to grow explosively for another 15 years after that. So that's an indication of a system that was behaving very differently, a system that was acting much tougher on crime. So that's how you get an ever-growing prison population at a time when crime rates and arrest rates are actually pretty stable. Can we go to the next slide? Down. Yeah, there we go. So this gives you imprisonment rates now in a national perspective. The blue line on top is the number of state prisoners nationally per 100,000 residents. Wisconsin's imprisonment rate is the red line. And you can see that the Wisconsin story, roughly speaking, is tracking a national story of great imprisonment boom in the late 20th century. Now, Wisconsin's growth in imprisonment is actually occurring at a faster rate than the nation as a whole. So if you wind back to the early 1970s, Wisconsin in the national perspective is a very low imprisoning state. Our imprisonment rate is about half the national average. And today, basically, we're at the average. We're at 97% of the national average. So where Wisconsin fits into the national story has changed quite a bit over the course of a generation. Can we go to the next slide? Down. So this gives you another state for purposes of comparison. That is Minnesota, our neighbor to the west. If you go back to the 50s, 60s, early 70s, Wisconsin and Minnesota have essentially identical imprisonment rates for a long period of time, which is exactly what you would expect, right? We know these are neighboring states, similar size, similar demographically, historically, culturally, politically. But beginning in mid-1970s, the imprisonment rates start to diverge pretty dramatically. And really since 1980, Wisconsin's imprisonment rate has very consistently been twice as high or even more than twice as high as Minnesota's is. So you can see there a reflection of some very different approaches in the two states to criminal justice. Minnesota emphasizes the use of probation much more extensively as a sentence than Wisconsin does. Wisconsin relies much more heavily by comparison on prison sentences. What's the impact on public safety? Could you go to the next slide? Okay, this gives you violent crime rates. The line on top is the nation as a whole. The two on the bottom are Wisconsin and Minnesota. You can see, fortunately, Wisconsin and Minnesota have very consistently had significantly lower violent crime rates than the nation as a whole. And in fact, Wisconsin and Minnesota are basically moving in tandem over decades with respect to crime rates. In recent years, if anything, Minnesota's had the advantage. So there's not much basis for concluding that Minnesota's criminal justice policies, which again emphasize the use of probation more, not much evidence that those policies are producing worse public safety outcomes than Wisconsin's imprisonment-heavy approach. Okay, could you move to the next slide? Thank you. This slide gives you a sense of one of the major reasons why imprisonment has grown so much in Wisconsin. This compares maximum sentences for a variety of crimes in 1987 to 2017. I don't know, I see some younger faces in the crowd. 1987 might sound like ancient history to you. I have to say that for me, that was the year I graduated from high school. It feels like it was just yesterday. So when I say things have changed a lot since 1987, that, at least to me, is a pretty striking point of comparison. But you can see maximum sentences are higher literally across the board. Any crime you can think of, this is the maximum possible sentence today is higher than it was in 1987. And in some cases, it's literally decades higher now than it was in 1987. Can you Move on? Okay. This slide depicts something that Steve alluded to in his opening remarks. One of the common misperceptions about mass incarceration is that it is simply a function of the war on drugs. That's not true. The war on drugs certainly has contributed to the phenomenon of mass incarceration, but mass incarceration it encompasses an awful lot more than just drug crime. So this slide depicts the Wisconsin prison population. The darker shaded area in the bottom is the number of prisoners serving time for drug offenses. And you can see throughout this time period that it's actually a distinct minority of the prison population. And in fact, it's been going down pretty sharply the last dozen years, so it's under 10% of the state prison population. Would you mind switching to the next slide? Thank you. Thank you. So this gives you a little more updated information about what people are serving time for in Wisconsin prisons today. That little red wedge of the pie, that's your drug offender population. The biggest slice of the pie there is actually the revocation population. That's an interesting group of prisoners to think about. These are people who were in the community on supervision and subject to a lot of conditions of release. They violated a condition and were returned to prison on that basis. It's something else Steve alluded to in his remarks. And you can see that that's really quite a sizable share. It's about a third of our prison population, people doing time for revocations. In some cases, they've been revoked because they did something that constituted new criminal activity. In a lot of cases, what they did was more of a technical violation, not a new crime in itself, but maybe they were associating with the wrong people, or were in a place they shouldn't have been, or failed to check in with their probation officer regularly, or whatever. Okay, could you move to the last slide? This is my very last slide, promise. This brings us into the issue of racial disparities in the prison population. Maybe some of you know that Wisconsin has one of the worst problems with racial disparities in its prison population in the United States. It's certainly not a new phenomenon. It's not just a byproduct of mass incarceration. The first comparison there goes back all the way back to 1970. That's before the prison population started to explode. That's showing you that the state population, this is the blue or purple, the state population is 3% African American in 1970, and the prison population 30% African American in 1970. 2004, as we're getting to that plateau level with our prison population, the African American portion of the general population in the state is up to about 6%, and the prison population now 47% African American. Since then, the disparity has softened a little bit. The African American share of the general population now about 7%, share of the prison population down to about 40%. So it's still a huge disparity. It's somewhat less stark than it was a dozen years ago. And a lot of what that's about is Milwaukee. Things have been happening in Milwaukee. Milwaukee County has 3/4 of the state's African American population, and that's where I live and work in Milwaukee. So things going on with the Milwaukee criminal justice system tend to be the main driver of African American incarceration in the state. And maybe some of you know there's been a lot of criminal justice reform locally in Milwaukee County in recent years, and that's included a really actually pretty dramatic decrease in the number of people being incarcerated for drug offenses in Milwaukee County. And that's the primary reason why the African American numbers in the state prison population have been coming down a little bit. So that's the end of my slides, and let me turn it over to Representative Koike.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for having me. I have to confess, I was Professor O'Here's student. I think I took 5 classes during law school from Professor O'Here.
Couldn't get rid of the guy.
And I paid attention, even though I sat in the back. So I represent a district of about 57,000 people on the north side of the city of Milwaukee. Just to give you a little bit of a background, it is the second smallest legislative district in the state assembly. That means it's very urban. It's a core of neighborhoods in the central city. It's the most racially diverse district in the state of Wisconsin in terms of the state assembly. We, in the 18th Assembly District, defy many of the norms of how segregated our city and our state are. And so it's a very interesting place. There's a lot of assets and a lot of challenges. I live in a neighborhood called Historic Concordia. It's a relatively small and very old historic neighborhood. It's a majority African American neighborhood. It is perennially one of the top 10 high crime neighborhoods of the city of Milwaukee, making it perennially one of the top 10 high crime neighborhoods in the state of Wisconsin. And I'm going to end my comments in the beginning with how you actually reduce crime in a neighborhood like mine. But let me start by making some comments about how we got to the place that Professor O'Here just ended his commentary on about both about racial disparities but also about our prison population. I was elected in November of 2012, sworn in January of 2013. So from January of 2013 until today's date, the state legislature has passed and signed into law about 65 new laws that increase criminal penalties or create new laws. About 65, it's not exact, but I can tell you the number of laws we've passed that have reduced criminal penalties or erased crimes, and that's 0. So you can see in about 6 years, this is the one-way street of the criminal justice system. Things only get more severe. They very rarely go the other way. And I'll admit that a number of these bills or new laws or new criminal penalties I've supported. Sometimes we do need to update our criminal code. One of the best examples I can think of is updates in technology. We still have fraudulent use of a telegram. All right, that needs to be updated, right? People aren't telegramming anymore, so for some of you young people, you may not know what a telegram is or was. So we need to figure out how to update our criminal code to deal with this technology. A lot of stuff, bad stuff, can be done with a smartphone these days. One example that I can think of that I supported is a new law that we call upskirting. It is a nefarious practice of filming largely women in public spaces in a very in a way that violates their privacy, and then the dissemination of that broadly through social media or through electronic means. That is a form of sexual assault and invasion of privacy, and so there really should be, in my opinion, a criminal law that makes it illegal to upskirt, to film that behavior. We didn't have a law on the books because we didn't really have technology to do that 20 or 30 years ago. So sometimes these law changes are good. By and large, they're not, and they're not needed. What happens largely in the political process and largely on a bipartisan basis is something really tragic happens. And the media covers that tragedy. And they should cover that tragedy. A homicide is newsworthy. And I really don't necessarily care who committed that homicide. That should be, it should be talked about. The victim should be talked about. You as a neighbor or me as a neighbor should know what's happening. But in reaction to that bad thing that happened, elected officials are called upon to act. And we don't know how to solve complex problems in a way that delivers easy results to the electorate, or at least not immediate results. So our response, by and large, and again, in a bipartisan way, has been to make the thing, that bad thing, more illegal, or triple illegal, or quadruple illegal. So armed robbery happens, and now's the time that if it wasn't a 40-year felony, and if it was 50 or 60 years, or if we make the repeat offender exposed to 10 years instead of 5, that'll really teach them a lesson, and we'll finally see that behavior cease. And so what has happened is politicians and the electorate underneath the politicians have called for the criminal justice to become the system to solve all social ills. And it can't do that. It is a reactionary system that cannot solve complex social and economic problems. And so we've pushed more and more behaviors into the criminal system by creating more and more crimes. There's, I don't know what the most recent, there's over 500 felonies and well over, I think, 600 or 700 misdemeanors. So there's a lot of illegal behavior in Wisconsin. And so the net gets cast wider and wider, and more of this kind of frustrating or scary behavior becomes illegal, and then more and more people enter the criminal justice system. And if you are a person of great means and you enter the criminal justice system, the outcome is very likely to be different and more positive than if you are a person of lesser means. And so a lot, and at least in my opinion, a lot of those racial disparities follow economics and wealth. Because if you have money to get out of jail through cash bail, the sentence that you will get is much more likely to be less than if you walk into the courtroom in chains for the sentencing hearing. And think about why that's the case. If you're out in the community, you can keep your job, you can attend treatment programming, you can rally support from your families and from your minister or from your boss. And when you come before the court for sentencing, you present a much different picture of who you are as a defendant than if you come in chains. And as a former and recovering lawyer, I can tell you that happened all the time. And so you're much more likely to walk out of the courtroom on probation if you walked into the courtroom from the community and not in chains. And so there are also additional ways in which wealth plays into that. I don't want to make any disparaging comments about my wife, who's a public defender, or my friends who are public defenders, but there is a reality that if you can afford a lawyer who has 40 cases, or you can't afford a lawyer and you have one that has 140 open cases, there's a difference in the amount of time and attention that your lawyer can give to your case. And I worked as hard as I could as a public defender. I very much took offense to being called a public pretender. I didn't pretend to advocate for my clients. I thought I did a darn good job. But the reality was that on a given morning in Milwaukee County, I would have 6 cases, and that's just different than a lawyer that has 2. It just meant I had less time to sit and consult with family members or to visit clients that were incarcerated. Thus, the time and attention that my client got because of the system was reduced. And so what ends up happening is, by and large, or on whole, or en masse, individuals present to the decision maker, to the judge, very differently, and sentences are very unequal. The same then is true, I think, in many of the instances in the justice system in which we rely on human discretion. When I was driving down here today, I got up a little later than I should have, because I stayed up last night a little later than I should have, and I was speeding. The state troopers positioned on I-90-39 have discretion over whether to pull me over or not. So their biases play into whether or not they're going to pull me over. So the fact that I'm a 30-something white guy in a suit and tie driving my parents' minivan because my wife has a car, that all goes into the factors of whether or not they're going to pull me over. And so the way people enter, the way they are treated, and the way they're exit the justice system, all who we are, where we come from, the wealth we have, that all goes into the contributing to some of the problems and disparities that we have. So how do we actually solve problems is the challenging question for me in politics, because as I opened my comments, I live in a high crime neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood where it's not uncommon for shots to be heard, for crime to happen. I have been personally a victim of crime. My families have been personally victims of crime. My brother-in-law who lives with me was robbed at gunpoint around the corner. We've had multiple homicides in my neighborhood. So how do we stop that? How do we solve that? In my opinion, it has very little to do with the penalties that are assessed once that crime happens, and much more to do with the fabric, the social fabric, the economic fabric of the neighborhoods that have high crime rates. So what we ought to be doing is disrupting the status quo of intense economic and racial segregation, and that's true whether you're talking about Beloit or the north side of the city of Milwaukee. It actually takes investments. I'd encourage you, maybe a week ago, there was a great article in the Journal Sentinel in Milwaukee's newspaper chronicling efforts of nonprofits. This is based in part of the work of a New York professor named Patrick Sharkey. He wrote a book called Uneasy Peace, which is, I think, a really interesting book for you to consider reading if you're interested in really talking and learning about inputs into the criminal justice system and crime rates. And what Professor Sharkey says in his book, what he's labeled, he calls people neighborhood guardians. And essentially what he's talking about is empowering residents to work with law enforcement, to work with their neighbors, communities of faith, nonprofit, business, etc., to restore a non-law enforcement police agency, a social police that can get into house by house, block by block into the neighborhood and repair people's trust in one another and do simple little things like make blighted properties more beautiful, increase lighting, plant flowers. Those type of social controls, in my experience in the neighborhoods where I live and where I represent, those things have a greater impact in reducing crime than a mandatory minimum law passed in Madison. It turns out, I'll cut through this. It turns out that most of the people on my block don't follow every action of state government. They don't stay up and watch us debate on the floor of the state assembly late into the night. They don't get a text alert that says, warning, the Assembly Bill 123 has passed and now it's a mandatory minimum to possess a firearm. People generally don't think about that stuff when they engage in criminal activity because most of the time people are not rational when they're engaging in criminal behavior. It's very rare for me as a lawyer when I would have a conversation with my client that they would say, Goike, I did this cost-benefit analysis of the criminal penalties that might be assessed on me and whether or not I'd be a party to a crime of the armed robbery. No, they get caught up in the moment. They make very impulsive decisions, sometimes very desperate decisions. Oftentimes, you have the layers of mental illness and addiction that further make people non-rational actors. And so it turns out that the fabric of my neighborhood matters more than the laws that will be imposed once caught. And I'll end by just saying, in reaction to where I started, imagine two candidates for office. Imagine we are debating on stage today, and the question comes up about what you're going to do about crime. And maybe Beloit has had a rash of something, car thefts or burglaries. I guarantee you that the candidate that stands up and says, we're going to lock them up, we're going to be tough, we're going to teach them a lesson, will garner more public support, at least in today's political climate, than if I stood up and said, well, we're going to do a series of strategic investments at the neighborhood level and we're going to work together and we're going to blah, blah, blah. It's just not sexy. It just doesn't deliver the hit and the immediacy that the electorate has come to demand after when bad things happen. And so it's challenging as an elected official to make those fairly complex long-term arguments and avoid the trap that both parties have been in for the last 40 years, which is a knee-jerk reaction to bad things happening and demanding and pushing the criminal justice system to be the only answer through increased penalties, new crimes, or enhanced sentences. I'll just want to put a little plug in. I've got a little booklet that I wrote. I'm switching gears here. In trying to communicate with my colleagues in Madison about criminal justice reform, I have experienced that just yelling about it during a committee debate or on the floor of the assembly is very ineffective. So I wrote this little booklet about, it's entitled Inmate 501. It's about our prison population. I'm going to leave copies at the table for you to take. It's a real up-to-date snapshot on where we are with our prison population and what the next couple of years may look like if we don't do anything, as well as proposing a couple of reform suggestions. I tried to have a bit longer of a conversation with my colleagues in Madison about what we really need to do and why. And one of the pieces that's in there is a reform and repurposing of the Lincoln Hills juvenile prison. And I can report to you that as of Thursday, the state legislature has concluded its business and sent a bill on a unanimous vote in both chambers to the governor for signing that will close Lincoln Hills by January 1 of 2021, and in the meantime establish a new network of juvenile facilities and a network that will rely more heavily on counties and local communities, regions, coming up with solutions rather than having the State Department of Corrections being the major warehousing entity for juveniles that are incarcerated. And I'm happy to answer questions about that or to have individual conversations if you have questions about that proposal. That is a ray of hope for where the state could go in terms of justice reform. The final thing I'll say is generally, as you look around the country, there's no one party that is able to successfully reform their justice system alone. It's very frequently bipartisan efforts. Coalitions of the ACLU, the Koch brothers, Rand Paul, Cory Booker, and so it takes that kind of bipartisan effort and coalition to really bring meaningful justice reform. And I think this latest provision about Lincoln Hills could be a foundation from which we see greater bipartisan success on adult criminal justice reform in the years coming.
Before we go any further, I'd like to invite anybody in the audience who has a question or a comment at this point. I believe, do we have microphones for people who are asking questions? Yes, we do. Tom? And if you could just identify yourself and then say who your question is directed at. Thanks.
Okay, I'm Tom Warren. I'm a retired Lloyd College professor. Why is Wisconsin so bad on racially related variables compared to the other states?
Thank you for the question. The question was, why is Wisconsin so bad in the racial disparities? It's not just prison. It's workforce, it's education, so the one point I would say is in my years in office, trying to address that very issue, I have come to the truth, at least in my vision, is that it's not just the justice system. We have one of the largest gaps in income and wages, in unemployment, in education outcomes. And so far too many people are born into layers of systems, and not just the prison system. That's certainly one, and a major one, that are just rampant with racial disparities. And in my view, in part, it comes from the reality, and we must confess openly, we are a very segregated state. We have always been a very segregated state. My city in Milwaukee was founded on the principle of segregation. At the time, not African-American segregation, but there were literally, the history of Milwaukee is the history of, you live on that side of the river, and I'll live on this side, and we'll hate each other, and we'll just develop separately. And that has carried through Irish and German and Polish and African-American and Hmong, and so we have to break down those barriers. It's not just the justice system. Now, there are ways that we can work and reduce racial disparities in the justice system. It's not hopeless and it's not useless, but I think that your question is far broader that the justice system is more of a symptom of a deeper disease than necessarily its own cause.
But why Wisconsin for all of these things, right? I mean, it's complicated, it's decades long, but as we are ranked amongst the states, I mean, we're dead last in some of these things, right?
Yes.
If I can say, I used to know the top 4 states in terms of disparity in the justice system, but my mind doesn't work as good as it used to. But I know Iowa has had a huge problem as well. New Jersey has as too. So one thing that's encouraging that I'm seeing around the country is the what's called racial impact laws that are being passed. Governor Christie just signed one in New Jersey, because even though New Jersey had dropped its prison population, the disparity in terms of African Americans within the system did not drop. So as the prison population went down, the disparities stayed right in the same proportion. So the way a racial impact analysis could work is a law is passed. Before that law can go into effect, there has to be a racial impact analysis done to see what would be the underlying disparities as a result of that law. And the thinking goes that if it is beyond some particular ratio, that then the law would have to be reconsidered. Iowa has passed such a provision. New Jersey just recently has. I think there's one other state making sure that it's actually used and that there's some teeth in it is of course the challenge. But that could be part of how we begin to at least address how laws that go onto the books can be tempered and rethought based on race implications. There's another similar impact that I see happening, which begins to go to what Evan pointed out, which we see. Somebody is going to stand up after there's been a series of a wave of crime, and is going to say, we need to here's my bill to enhance this punishment. There's a couple of states now that are saying, well, let's have an impact analysis around that. So somebody stands up and beats their chest and the law is passed. But before it can go into effect, there's a impact analysis that is done, and this could be an impact based on what it's going to cost the system in the long term, or thinking about the implications for the corrections department, however you want to frame it. But you could create a commission, and of course there are issues about who's on it and all of that, but how could we create a system where somebody does that, we have an impact analysis, that commission then takes its time and at the end of the day says, you know what, this is going to be problematic for these reasons. It still gives the politician the opportunity to say, I championed it, because guess what? In that moment of media attention, 6 months later, the public has forgot about it. So how can we, in the heat of the moment, still allow somebody to, tragically, but, in this environment, still allow that person to stand up and beat their chest and push for some new bill. But then we create some safety valve within the system, quite frankly, that then you can send a bad bill to go wither away, to die. So anyway, these are some thoughts on it.
What do you think the notion to get rid of the exception clause that says in the 13th Amendment that slavery shall be illegal except as a punishment for crime, to make it still legal, unless it's a punishment for crime, which African Americans are so much more impacted?
Well, I'm not sure that language has a whole lot of legal significance. significance to it, but it certainly has some symbolic significance. I mean, the suggestion of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the suggestion there is that slavery is abolished except for people committed crime, convicted of crime. So the implication is that prisoners are like slaves.
Yes.
That's the implicit analogy being drawn. And that kind of thinking undoubtedly was very powerful and important, especially in the South in the decades following the adoption of the 13th Amendment, where prisoners were subjected to really horrific conditions, forced labor conditions that really were completely indistinguishable as a practical matter from the conditions they had existed in under slavery. And that mindset carries forward to some extent, at least from the standpoint of a legal system. New legal doctrines developed in the 1960s and 1970s, recognizing that prisoners actually do have constitutional rights and that courts have a role in enforcing those rights. And in general, there has been some improvement in the lives of prisoners around that prisoner rights revolution. Although there's still certainly a lot of degrading and inhumane treatment that takes place in prisons. One very important contemporary issue, probably some of you are aware of, is solitary confinement and excessive use of solitary confinement, which pretty much everywhere else in the world is recognized as a form of torture. Solitary confinement, and yet it's routinely used in quite a few American penal institutions. There's all kinds of research that demonstrates significant psychological harm that occurs as a result of protracted periods of solitary confinement. People who are put into solitary confinement are disproportionately mentally ill to begin with, and that explains why they can't conform to prison rules very well. And then the solitary confinement doesn't make them any better. It actually tends to exacerbate mental illness. So, I think continued use of solitary confinement is a reminder that that old mindset, that 19th century mindset, still persists to some extent, that prisoners are not fully citizens, they're not fully human beings anyway, at some level. They don't have rights that need to be fully recognized by others.
Just as I was thinking just now about it, Michael, part of what I think our challenge is how do we think beyond where we are now? How do we create more of a mass movement for change? How do we challenge the notion, maybe there needs to be a movement, as I'm seeing now around gun violence, people are saying, well, maybe we need a movement to challenge, to amend the Second Amendment. Maybe we need a movement that begins to redefine what the 13th Amendment was or is, Much more transformative thinking needs to take place. So we have come to a point where we see our Constitution in this sort of static way, where we as citizens of the democracy feel that we are hamstrung by what there is. Imagine though a larger social transformation where we actually challenge the document that we have, where we seek to expand our rights within it. And that may be where we need to go if we're not able to actually make changes happen within the legislative parameters that exist now.
The one thing I would just like to address, and I think that is absolutely a great point, Stephen, but the legal authority upon which the Department of Corrections in the state of Wisconsin draws its ability to pay inmates a fraction of the minimum wage is not the United States Constitution, but the system of statutes, laws, and regulations in the state. One thing I wanted to mention, and maybe to just put on the horizon and watch for, there are states that are opening prison labor to private entities, private business. So the state of Wisconsin does not have private prisons. The state operates all of our facilities. That doesn't mean that there aren't private businesses that serve the prisons, laundry, food service, the commissary, telephones. There's a lot of private entities that do get financial benefit from the prison population. But I think it's the state of Kansas that's trying to really open up private entities being allowed to use incarcerated individuals to work for them, pay them the prison wage, and I think that's a very, very dangerous road for any state to go on, where you have private industry directly benefiting from labor at $1, $2 an hour wage. And so that's currently not happening in Wisconsin. We do have prisoners in Wisconsin do work. We do have an entity called Prison Industries, and prisoners make many things in the state of Wisconsin. Furniture that the university system, the state government uses, the road signs, license plate. There's lots of things that are made in prison, but those are not private companies that are able to access prison labor. But I do see a bit of that trend, and I think that's where we get really dangerous, where we are actually allowing private, for-profit corporations to pay people sub-minimum wage, sub-minimum wage, and have incarcerated people work for them, and it's very, very dangerous.
So imagine a transformative approach that says, can we teach people 21st century skills in prison? And so in California, in San Quentin, a non-for-profit, a venture capitalist who, part of the Silicon Valley group, he had gone into prison, did some kind of talk at San Quentin, and he said to himself, boy, some of these guys are really sharp. I have coders in Silicon Valley who dropped out of college and, or didn't go to college, and, and they're on my payroll. So he created a nonprofit entity that works in prison and started teaching inmates at San Quentin coding. He created sort of a closed internet, so it wasn't an internet that everyone could get on, but a closed system within the prison, paying the highest wage that we know about in the country at like $17 an hour. And this nonprofit is working to obtain, it's gaining business, right? So in my old job, we hired, it's called the Last Mile Project. We hired them to redesign our website. And now as these guys are getting out, first of all, they're leaving prison with $5,000 in the bank, right? And I sat in their offices in San Francisco, and here's a gentleman who had been out of prison for a few months, just coming back from interviews. He had interviewed with Mercedes-Benz. He had interviewed with 3 or 4 tech companies because he knows computer coding. So we can re-envision what's possible in that way. And now what Last Mile is trying to do is they're talking with various corrections departments around the country, is to take that model nationally and begin to think about how we can again create some real opportunities for folks coming out, and instead of exploiting labor, actually find ways that we could enhance people's possibilities.
Well, hi, my name is Charles Westerberg, and I teach in the sociology department here at Beloit College. And my question has to do with kind of the different levels of the pipeline. We heard about the police a little bit, and we heard about the prison system and sentencing, the legislative system. But I'm interested if someone could speak about the decision to prosecute or to charge. We hear a lot these days about plea bargaining and its effect on the system, and so I'm wondering if someone could comment on that.
So let me give you just a very basic view of how this works. Something allegedly happens, a crime, and that oftentimes is triggered by a call to police. 911 or a non-emergency call to police. Sometimes it happens through the law enforcement's own observation. Goike was speeding on I-39, so we pulled him over, smelled marijuana, searched the car, found some, thus the criminal case begins. Police write summaries, police reports, a narrative, just like telling the story of what happened. Those reports are then given to the district attorney's office. Assistant district attorney or district attorney in Wisconsin has the discretion of whether or not to charge a crime or no process a crime, decide not to prosecute. They can make those decisions on a whole host of reasons. Their initial assessment must include whether or not the crime could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. That's the legal standard in the criminal system. If in their opinion, if that's true, which crime, which elements of the offense are satisfied based on the facts as they believe would come out at trial. They need to look through potential constitutional challenges. Was Goike's stop a violation of his Fourth Amendment right? Was it a warrantless seizure that was unconstitutional? So those things factor in. They can also, they're humans, so they can actually look and see, does this warrant prosecution? And I think Professor O'Heir mentioned drug offenses from Milwaukee County. Does it make sense to charge that person for the end of a joint of 0.2 grams of marijuana? Or instead of a criminal prosecution, do we assess a civil forfeiture, a fine, in a county ordinance rather than a state criminal charge? So those are all discretionary decisions that the district attorney has. I would say it's a very vast discretion in the state of Wisconsin. There's a lot of pressure. When I was a third-year law student, I was dead set on being a prosecutor. And so I spent my final year in the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office and actually got to sit in on these decision-making conferences and type up. If a district attorney decides to prosecute, they file in Wisconsin a criminal complaint, which is an actual document, a written document that outlines the crime, the penalties, and a summary of the facts to establish that it probably took place. So I typed those up, and it was fascinating. It's a very challenging process to be in. You have police officers, oftentimes in front of the district attorney, telling them what happened and going through their reports. Sometimes the decision takes a long time to come to. There are certain timelines in place, but they're fairly generous, so a district attorney doesn't necessarily need to make the decision right then and there. And it can be reviewed by supervisors, etc. That discretion is massive and is incredibly important. In my experience, once the criminal complaint is signed and the process starts, it is very hard to undo. It then becomes a game. And a case is assigned a number. And that number then becomes a piece of congestion on the court's docket. They want to get cases through the system as fast as possible. It becomes yet one more case that the public defender has, one more that the district attorney has to have. And in my experience in Milwaukee, we would often, months later, have a conference about a plea negotiation. And we would come to the conclusion that this case doesn't really need to be in criminal court. That 3 months later, the kid, 19-year-old's back on track. It was a retail theft. He doesn't need a criminal conviction, and we'd settle it with a forfeiture. But that should have happened 3 months earlier, and the whole thing should never have started in the first place. Because in Wisconsin, for now, and we're going to fix this if I have anything to say with it, CCAP, our public records interface system, will have that kid was charged. And there's actually no legal way for that kid to get that off of CCAP under certain circumstances there are. But so even just beginning, the filing of the criminal complaint has massive consequences for that person. So that is an area of massive discretion that needs to be monitored. But I don't know if nationally there are. I think it would be very interesting to look up what the District Attorney of Philadelphia has just put out, that memo, new office policies on charging decisions. It's exciting to me to see what Philadelphia is doing. I think it'll be very interesting to watch what happens in the weeks and months to come as those policies are implemented. But Philadelphia is a very current example of a prosecutor changing their charging policies on certain crimes.
I'm glad Evan mentioned Philadelphia because what is happening now, and it's been supported some by George Soros, who is a liberal philanthropist, is how do we begin to change who is the prosecutor in these counties? Can we create, as there is now in Philadelphia, a progressive prosecutor who has a whole different vision of what his or her job should be? So we have about a dozen new prosecutors who have recently come into office. George Soros helped to bankroll parts of their efforts, but beginning to, the prosecutor is the most powerful person within the criminal justice system with absolute discretion. And if we can begin to reimagine who holds that office, it could be transformative. I used to always say when I used to travel in the South working with the NAACP, as I saw, in city or in towns, as the civil rights movement came in, and the impact of people having political power, the system would let you be the mayor, but the system would not allow you to be the sheriff or the district attorney. You could become the mayor of New Orleans, but Harry Connick Sr. was going to rule, as the district attorney for 30 years, and that is, and it's still like that, but it's beginning to change, and that has to happen.
Our time has absolutely flown by, and I see that there are several hands in the audience, so what I'm going to ask is we'll take maybe 3 more questions, one right after the other, and then we'll let each of them answer the question. So I know we have a question in the back, we have a question over here, and then we have a question back there. Hello?
Oh, hi. I used to live in Milwaukee County, and I'm a veteran, and I got involved with some criminal activity. But the one thing that I see that's not being addressed with the criminal justice system is mental health, the mental health system, because I know when I was into drugs and things like that, the only reason that I got out of the system was because I was a veteran. And the veteran has a lot of different programs, and I was able to get into housing, and I was able to move back to Beloit, and I was able to buy a house. But that was only because I was given a chance, and I see a lot of people black people in Milwaukee that I used to get high with, and they get into the system and they can't get out because they're not veterans and they don't get a chance. So I think the mental health system needs to be addressed.
I was just with questions directed at Hawkins. You talked about the aging population in the prison system, and I was wondering if there's been any research into how prior to their aging, prison conditions worsen for them. Like if there's sorry, I'm really nervous. And like how being in solitary confinement can worsen your health, and how that contributes to the aging population, and how is that being considered when people reform?
And then we have Deborah.
Yeah. I'm Deborah Majid. I teach religious studies here, and I'm hoping
Where do you get your mic, Deborah?
Oh, sorry. I'm Deborah Majid. I teach religious studies here, and I'm hoping you can give advice for how students can address the problem. Apparently, Wisconsin is one of 35 states that does not forbid police officers to have sex with those in their charge. And this is going to be a project that my class will address in the fall, so if you can give us a starting point, I appreciate it.
So I'll say, address what you raised around solitary. Sure, solitary confinement and national averages where people will spend 100+ days. or the supermax here, you know, these long-term management of people in solitary confinement, it absolutely destroys human beings. You know, no one's going to go through that length of time and not have impact on their mind and most likely as well on their body. Prison health is bad. You know, prison health care is bad as it is, but with an aging population, you have all of the issues that come with aging. Prisons aren't designed for an aging population. Some are now having to be retrofitted. There's a huge swirl of issues, but you know, I'm happy to talk more with you about it.
Briefly there. As far as the impact of prisons on health, there has been a fair amount of research on this, and the best studies, of course, have to take into account who are the people who are going into prisons and what are the deficits that they carry with them in prison, and what would their experiences be like out of prison. And actually the researchers have struggled to demonstrate that prison is adversely affecting the health of the people who are in prison. The physical health, I'm just talking about physical health here, not mental health. And the reason is, I mean, this is quite a testament to the way that our prison system is so disproportionately incarcerating people who are poor, people who are coming out of deeply disadvantaged communities who didn't have access to health care before prison, who won't have access to health care when they leave prison. In fact, for a lot of them, prison is better from a health standpoint because they do have a constitutional right to some bare minimum of health care while they're in the institution. Now, the constitutional standards are very low, and I don't mean to suggest that any of you should regard prison health care as a model that you should want for yourself. Still, it's better than nothing. And for an awful lot of people in prison, the reality is that the alternative for them would be nothing.
So I have two things that I'm going to say. First is a response to the housing and mental health question earlier, and then the second will be to the police issue that you brought up. It was not uncommon every year around the fall as it started to get cold to see the same names enter the Milwaukee County criminal justice system, chronically homeless individuals that would do minor things. Remember one of my clients put a whole bunch of steaks in his pants and tried to walk out of the grocery store, knowing of course he was going to get caught, knowing of course he's done it 20 times in the past, and he did it because he would rather survive a winter in jail than die a death out in the cold. And that wasn't an unheard of story for healthcare as well. I remember one client specific who got arrested so that he could have his teeth pulled because he was dealing with this terrible abscessed tooth, and he knew if he went in and complained of tooth pain, he would get care. And those are lives that are in circumstances that are dire, marginalized, and people that need an enormous amount of love and investment in housing is one. I was in the back of a squad car consensually on a ride along in my neighborhood on 10th and North Avenue, which is really it's a probably heart of the historic African-American neighborhood in Milwaukee, and we were called to the scene of a woman who was suicidal. And she was on the street corner just sobbing, and she had a garbage bag with all of her worldly possessions in it. And she had been in and out of the system a number of times, and so we took her to the mental health facility, which was full. And we waited a number of hours to try to get her admitted, and tried at a private hospital to get her admitted, and there was no place for her to go. She was taken to the criminal justice facility, our county jail, as a means of last resort so that she didn't kill herself We didn't want to return her to the situation that she had called the police herself. She had done this cry for help, but there was literally no room anywhere except a jail cell for this woman, and it's just an absolute haunting experience. And so housing, immediate housing options, this rapid rehousing programs that have been successful are really critical. A warm, safe place for somebody to get some relief and respite is really missing from the system. Now to the question about how does one engage a campaign to change state law about police being legally, or at least it's not illegal for a police officer to have sexual contact with someone in their charge. First, it's an effort of education. So I will admit, I didn't know that. So first it's going to be a campaign of education. I will out my colleagues that are here. So you have Representative Mark Spreitzer in the audience and Senator Janice Ringhand in the first row. I'm not saying you can't work with me, but you do have locals here. And so first and foremost, it's a matter of research. Where in the system of laws is that a missing piece? Where should it fit? It's a matter of contacting your local officials, and if not them, others that have worked on the issue. And then I would suggest, and this is just impromptu strategy, you have to work with law enforcement to do this. You have to do a little research to figure out how much of a problem it has been. That means reported and unreported instances. I can think of a couple of former police officers that worked for Milwaukee Police Department that went to prison for sexual allegations. So there's a starting point. You have cases, very public cases, at least in Milwaukee. You have to build your case with the facts, and then I would engage the police organizations, that's local as well as statewide, and you would need their support to have a successful campaign to change state law. I would assume that if confronted with the truth, they may want to be on the right side of history and not trying to cover up for bad officers that abuse their people in their custody. But if you have them leading the charge, it'd be 10 times more likely to be successful than if you were trying to push against. Law enforcement have a number of very influential political organizations that I interface with regularly, that lawmakers interface with regularly, so knowing that and engaging with them would be a critical step in the process.
Nina Taylor just put that in your law this last week.
Okay, so apparently it was just introduced. So I can tell you that, so Senator Lena Taylor from Milwaukee has introduced the bill. Thank you, Senator Ringhand. That bill will not pass this year, but you at least have a foundation to work from. And so the call would be to Senator Taylor, potentially to have a meeting with her to go through the details of her bill, work to make sure over the summer and fall that those details have the support of those law enforcement groups, the research and background to bring it forward.
Just very briefly on mental health piece, and that was a really great comment. Mental health problems are extremely common in the criminal justice system. Some of the research shows that 50% of prisoners suffer from mental health problems. Treatment is available to some extent, but one of the big problems is that treatment in institutions almost always means pills, because that's cheap. Counseling is much more expensive to deliver, especially individualized counseling. So mental health treatment in criminal justice facilities tends to be very one-dimensional. Medications work quite well for approximately 1/3 of the mentally ill population, but we're not really serving the needs of the